the Gemaras are not that we're learning today are not too long to learn, but they're the gold standard of all Gemaras that you learn in Shas. It really is the gold standard. It requires you just to have a little bit of logic, and you touch upon a lot of the rules of how to darshim psukim. So let us begin over here discussing. I'll just visually show it to you over here. Again, we're dealing with this pasuk over here that we learned before, that there's a pasuk that says that if your sister, your wife's sister, falls to Yibam, the Torah says Yibam doesn't apply. Okay, don't do Yibam. And there's an extra pasuk. There's an extra pasuk called Oleha. Oh, hold on. Hi, Alan. We just began. Hi, Alan. We just began.
Hi.
Okay, we just began. So what the Gemara is dealing with, I'm going to show it to you visually. The pasuk that says V'isha el achois lo sikach. Even if your wife's sister falls to Yibam, don't do the Yibam, lo sikach. Even if it's a mitzvah aleha, even if it's a yavam aleha, as we saw that the word aleha means Yibam, that by this pasuk, yavama yavay aleha. Even if your wife's sister falls to Yibam, don't do Yibam. So the Gemara is troubled by that. And here's the visual way to see it. The Gemara is troubled by that. Is like says, we always know the red over here, and this I got off the internet. The red over here is a loisase. And you look at the middle of the pictures is the essay. We always know an essay, a positive commandment, trumps a negative commandment. So if you have a choice between a positive commandment and negative commandment, you do the essay, and it overrides the lois essay. So that's what the Gemara says over here. But how do you know that axiom to be true? Is because we have tzitzis. The pasuk, we have a pasuk by tzitzis that says no matter what item you make the beged, the clothing that you're wearing, even if it's made out of linen, the Torah says you could put wool strings, attach it. So we see, even though it would be shatnez, we see the positive commandment of tzitzis overrides the negative commandment of shatnez. But the Gemara says, but that only shows you what? That only shows you that an essay is doicha loisase. But how do you see that Yibam, the essay should be doicha, the essay of doing the Yibam should override the loisase of not marrying your wife's sister? Marrying your wife's sister is a negative commandment, which involves kares, which is a much more severe type of avera. And that's more severe type of avera. We have never a source that says that essay should doicha a loisase sheyesh by kares. So therefore, the Gemara is saying is that the eleha is redundant. It's not needed, because even without eleha, I would know you don't do yibam to your wife's sister. So that's what the Gemara said. So the Gemara said yesterday, and this is where we end off and where we begin, that we do find another area that that we find a brisa that says that had it not been for a pasuk, I would have said that you should be Mechala Shabbos. What's that talking about? The brisa says that we know there's a mitzvah on Bezdin if somebody is chayiv to die, chayiv to fall capital punishment. The brisa says that the pasuk says v'humas. It's an obligation, mitzvah say on Bezdin, to kill somebody who's required to die capital punishment. And then there's but the Torah says mechalalehu yumas, that if you transgress the Shabbos, you get misa. So the question was, what happens? Can Bezdin give misa to somebody on Shabbos? If they paskin that somebody's required to have capital punishment, would they have the leniency to have their mitzvahs essay override that lois essay? But the bottom line is, the brisa says no, not true, because there's a pasuk, an extra word moish seichem, which teaches you that even Bezdin, moish seichem means it's another synonym for Bezdin, and the Torah says loy savaru eish, that even Bezdin is not allowed to light a fire on Shabbos. One of the misas Bezdin is cooking up lead, sreifa. So the Torah is saying, don't do that, even if you're Bezdin. So we see from there, had it not been for that pasuk, the essay of Bezdin would have overridden the Shabbos, which is a lois essay that has kares for sure. If you and misa, so that's what we have our answer. Had it not been for the pasuk of Oleha, I would have thought that you could do yibam on your wife's sister. That's why I need Aleha. So you have a source that would give you an indication that an essay would override even a lois essay that has kares. That's why I need the Aleha. And this is where we left off on the bottom of the page of Vavam Beis. Bottom of the page of Vavam Beis. The Gemara says like this: Amar Rav Simi Barashi. Rav Simi Barashi said that we misread the Brisa. There is never a pre-thought that an essay could override a lois essay sheyesh by kares. That's an impossibility. So what's this Brisa trying to tell us? That Bezdin should give misa to somebody, even on Shabbos. What's that about? It's not because an essay should override a lois essay that has kares to it, right? This is a lois essay that has kares. Because I would have thought, thinking logically on my own, based on what some known facts, I would have come to the conclusion that Bezdin should be able to kill somebody on Shabbos. And this is what the Brisa means to say. Mani mekayim mechaleleho moisumas. The Brisa starts off, what is this mechaleleho moisumas? If you transgress the Shabbos, you get put to death. Bishar malachas. Anybody who does a malach on Shabbos gets the death penalty. Chutz mimisas Bezdin. Except Bezdin, that's mechalel Shabbos. If Bezdin carried out a capital punishment on Shabbos, nothing wrong with that. Aval Mises Bezdin, I would say that, so that pasuk excludes Mises Bezdin. But Mises Bezdin, Dachia Shabbos, should override Shabbos. Now, why would I say such a thing? Mi kal v'chomer. I would think about it myself. We go to Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. Uma avoida. We know the service in the temple. Let's say the carbon tamid, the carbon musaf that you brought on Shabbos, that involved, chil Shabbos. You slaughtered an animal, right? Shihi chamura. It's the very most severest type of way to be mechala Shabbos. V'doicha Shabbos, and yet it overrides Shabbos. We do shecht, carbon tamid, and the carbon musaf on Shabbos, and I circled it in green. So Shabbos is the most lenient. Avoida would override Shabbos. Now, so what is even more stronger than service in the temple? Ritzicha. Ritzicha means taking a kohen and killing him. Why would Bezdin want to kill a kohen? A kohen, let's say a kohen, the pasuk says that if a kohen killed somebody, so he's a murderer, and now he's working in the Beis HaMikdash, and even the pasuk says in Chumash, in Parshas Mishpatim, that even if that kohen is your only kohen, there's no other kohen in the world. If we kill him, we close down the temple because there is no kohen. The Torah says if Bezdin finds him to be guilty of murder, doicha oisa, we push away the whole service of the temple. Shenema me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamus. You take him off the mizbeach, even if he's started to do the avodah, you grab him by the neck with everything, you bring him to the jail, and then you kill him because he's a murderer. So we see that the most severest of all between Ritzicha, Avodah, and Shabbos, Ritzicha is the most important. So I would have said, so therefore, if Ritzicha overrides Avodah and Avodah overrides Shabbos, then certainly Ritzicha should override Shabbos. So Bezdin should be able to kill people on Shabbos. That's what the Gemara is saying. It's a kal v'chomer. Shabbos, shenitches mepnei Avodah, Shabbos, which is overridden by the service of the temple, ein edin. Certainly, you should be able to do capital punishments on Shabbos. If Ritzicha, again, if Avodah is more stronger than Shabbos, and Ritzicha is more stronger than Avodah, then by logical extension, Ritzicha would be would be able to override Shabbos. So that was what the Bryce is saying. No, nothing to do with essay doicha loisese. Umay oy einu dekama. What did the Bryce mean? To flip back, the Brisa said, no, maybe we got it all wrong. What was the Brisa thinking that we got it all wrong? It seems like a very straightforward Kal V'Chomer. So the Brisa is thinking Hachi Kamar. This is what the Brisa is thinking. I would say that Shabbos is the most severe, And because listen to this, kavuras meis mitzvah tichia, the burying of a dead body will prove everything wrong. What does that mean? A meis mitzvah is you find a dead body on the street, right? And there's nobody there to bury it. So then there's a mitzvah. Even a kohen should be metama himself for that. It means that a kohen normally can't touch a dead body, but if there's nobody else burying that body, the kohen has to stop whatever he's doing and bury that body. So meis mitzvah shedoiches ha'avoda, overrides the service. The service is the easy thing. So even if the kohen is on his way to the temple to do the service of the Beis Hamikdash, and he finds a dead body on the street, and if he is metama himself, will not have a service. Let's say he's the only kohen in the world, right? He has to stop going to the temple and just take care of burying that body. So avoida is the most lenient. Meis mitzvah is the most strictest. But ve'ein is more stricter. Ve'ein adoiches is Shabbos. But meis mitzvah does not override Shabbos. We don't bury a dead body on Shabbos and Michal Shabbos just because you see a dead body in the street. So we think, so meis mitzvah, so we see Shabbos is more important than meis mitzvah. And meis mitzvah, although it's more important than avodah, but Shabbos is more important than a meis mitzvah. So we'll say that just same thing over here. Shabbos will be more important than killing somebody on Shabbos, than doing Ritzicha, than Bezdin being carrying out a capital punishment. And we'll say, no, Bezdin should not carry out a capital punishment because we still find in certain cases where we don't be Mechal Shabbos, even though there's a great mitzvah, like a meis mitzvah. So even though you'll tell me there's a great mitzvah for Bezdin to carry out a capital punishment, but we won't give them the license to do so to be Mechal Shabbos. So that's the flip-flop. Then we flip back and we said, no, let's put everything together, and let us even say that the Brisa continues and says, flips back and says, maybe say even that you should bury a meis mitzvah on Shabbos. Hada Amar, then the Brisa continues and says, Kvuras meis mitzvah titches Shabbos. If you maybe let us say that burying a dead body should override Shabbos. Why? Because I'll say like this: Ma avoid Shabbos. The service in the temple overrides Shabbos. Kvuras meis mitzvah doichaisa, but kvuras meis mitzvah is more important than avodah. So that's even more important than avodah. How do you know that? Melachoisai. We know that. I've been telling you this, that we learn from an extra pasuk lachoisai that even if you're on your way to do the service in the temple, stop what you're doing and bury the meis mitzvah. So meis mitzvah is more important than avodah. So an avodah overrides Shabbos. Shabbos and nitcha mipnei avodah. Shabbos that moves away from avodah. Then say the same thing, that meis mitzvah should be the most important, most severe, and push away the whole Shabbos. So let us say that meis mitzvah is strongest, avodah is the next strongest, and Shabbos is the least strongest. So you go back and forth. So the Brisa is flopping. Can Bezdin take care of a capital punishment even on Shabbos? That's why the Brisa says Talmud Loimer lo yiseh va'aru, that Bezdin has no permission to carry out capital punishment on Shabbos. So basically, where we're holding over here is that it was not because of the essay doiche eloise say sheyesh by chorus. That's why the Brisa thought that you could carry out a capital punishment on Shabbos. It has nothing to do with that. It was just a old-fashioned kal v'chomer. And from that kal v'chomer, I would have came to the conclusion that Bezdin could carry out capital punishment on Shabbos, because since we find that you do the service in the temple override Shabbos, and carrying out a capital punishment overrides the service of the temple, so by extension, carrying out a capital punishment should override the Shabbos, and that's why. But it has nothing to do with our conversation of whether an essay could be doicha aloisa say sheyesh beikaris. Now, and because of that, if we have no source that an essay should override aloisa say sheyesh beikaris, then I don't need aleha, because even without aleha, or even without this aleha, I would know that you don't. Even without this aleha, let's cross it out. Even without this aleha, I would know that yavam, you don't do yibam to your wife's sister, because I have no source to say something like that. Ulamai desalik adaite. The Gemara just fills up a gap. In the first method, that way we learned the Brisa, you actually thought that the Brisa was dealing with an essay doicha loisase. So how did you learn pshat in the Brisa in the Havamina? The Gemara wants to know what was the flip-flop in the Brisa, even though the Gemara knocked away this Havamina, but the Gemara wants to understand, how did you read the Brisa in the first place? Mikara, the Brisa, the Brisa originally thought that an essay should override a loisase. Why did the Brisa flip to the other direction? So how did you learn pshat in the Brisa without anything? Hachi kamar. This is the way you learn pshat in the Brisa. Mani makai mechalel mois yumos. What do I learn with the pasuk? Those that transgress the Shabbos, nobody's allowed to transgress the Shabbos. That's talking about b'shar melachas. Anybody, you, me, anybody who does work on Shabbos, mois yumos, put to death. Chutz mimisas bezdin, except bezdin. Bezdin gets the license to kill somebody on Shabbos. Like the Brisa originally thought that an essay should override a loisase. And then the Brisa thought, then the Brisa had a flip and said, when would I say an essay overrides a loisase? Loisase gereda. If it's a regular loisase with no capital punishment attached. But a loisase sheyesh b'karos, if it's such a strong negative commandment that the Torah gives you a punishment of kares, of death, if you violate it, maybe mishamet le dedachi. Where would I have ever heard a thought that a positive commandment should override such a negative commandment? Hada'ama, then the Brisa meant to say, since we have a precedent for an essay bidoicha loisase, as I explained to you, tzitzis, where you see that mitzvah of tzitzis overrides the loisase of shatnez. So I would have thought like this: the Brisa says, "Ate essay doicha loisase lav loisase chamamine." Are really without the mitzvah of tzitzis, I would never say such a thing that a positive should override a negative. Usually, a negative commandment is much stronger than a positive commandment. A negative commandment means God says, don't do this. It's like sur meira, first get rid of the bad, va'asei tov. So usually my default logic, without knowing anything, is that the negative commandment is more stronger than the positive commandment. But once you prove to me from tzitzis that an essay could override a loisase, then I would say, you already tell me from a source that an essay could override a negative commandment. So then once it's overriding a negative commandment, I don't care how strong the negative commandment is. Mali chumr zuta or mali chumr rabba. What's the difference if it's a negative commandment with only malchus to it, or a strong negative commandment where you get kares to it? Once you know an essay can override it, it shouldn't matter. That's why the Brisa says, Loi Savaro, that even Bezdin should not override the negative of Shabbos. So that's the way we thought to learn the Brisa, but we even said that that's not the way to learn the Brisa. The Brisa is dealing with not an essay being doicha loisas, it's just a plain kal v'chomer. So where we're at right at this moment is we're back to that original kasha. You have to have this very clear in your mind. The question that we're dealing with is like this. Why is it that the Torah writes specifically that if your wife's sister falls to Yibam, you don't do Yibam? I know that because why should I say that you should have a right, the mitzvah of Yibam, which is a mitzvah's positive commandment, should override that negative commandment of marrying two sisters? That doesn't make sense. I never find an essay on positive commandment should override a negative commandment that has kares into it. I only find a source where a positive can override a plain negative, but not a negative that has kares. So even without Oleha telling me not to do such a thing, I would know on my own that you don't do such a thing. So why did I need this Oleha? So the Gemara says, Ella, rather, Sal Kadaita Chamina, let's think about it logically. Let's look at the mitzvah of Yibam itself. Every mitzvah of Yibam is an essay overriding a loises sheyesh b'kares. Because technically, you're never allowed to marry your brother's wife. If they have children and your brother dies, a person can't marry his brother's wife. There's a isser of eishes ach. It's only when the brother has no children, there's a mitzvah that says that you can marry this person, your wife of your brother, even though she's an erva to you. So we see that the mitzvah of yibum can override a kares. So I would say like this: to have a eishes ach, this eishes ach davar shayi beklal. It wasn't the rule of not to have arayis. You can't marry anybody who is an erva to you. It was a part of the general rule. V'yatzalim and klal l'lamed, and it was taken out of the general rule, saying in certain situations you are permitted to marry your brother's wife if your brother died and left over no children. So loy l'lamed al atzmai yatza. This is not to teach you about itself. El l'lamed al klal kula yatza. It teaches you about the rule, that the whole rule is that the mitzvah of yibum does not apply on any arayas. So even if there's another additional arayas to your wife, your brother's wife, for example, it's your wife's sister, you still would be allowed to do yibum, because we find that klal, that once something is the exception, it teaches you that the entire general rule is the exception. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa. Davash, and we should know these words should be familiar to you from davening. The last thing you say before they start Haidu in the morning is the Rabbi Yishmael Loima, the 13 rules on how to read the Torah. And one of the rules is Davar shayi b'chlal v'yotzim l'klal. Ketzad. Here's an example. Here's an example how you apply that rule. Let's take this example. I'm going to bring you this pasuk over here, so you can see it in right up here. The pasuk says that you're now allowed to eat kachim if you're tamei. The Torah says, if you have kachim, holy meat, and you have a tumah and you eat that kachim, you die young, you get kares. Then the Torah singles out zevach shlamim, a carbon shlamim, asher Hashem v'tumas I love. If you eat the carbon shlamim, you have tumah, you get kares. Now, why was the shlamim singled out of the general rule of all kachim you're not allowed to eat when you're tamei? Why did the Torah single this one out? Because it's teaching you that only types of time you get kares is if you're eating kachem from the mizbeach. That's something that was slaughtered by the mizbeach. Then if you have tameh in you, then you get kares. But what happens? Let's say somebody donated a chicken soup to the bedek, to the Beis Hamikdash. Whatever food that belongs to the Beis Hamikdash but was not mizbeach kachem, it was kachem bedek abayis, that doesn't apply. That teaches you that the whole rule of kares only applies by kache mizbeach. So that is called the davar sheyotzim in a klal. So what the Gemara is trying to say the same thing over here. There's a pasuk that says that you get kares if you marry or have relations with any of the arayos. If kol hayasim et you get kares. Then the Torah gives you a leniency that if your brother's wife dies, you can marry your brother's wife. It was singled out. There's a permissibility factor over here. So we'll say that in all cases, whenever there's an arayas with your brother's wife, not just the arayas of being your brother's wife, but also the arayas, let's say it's a sister of your wife, you would still be allowed to have marry her as the ibn. And that's why I need the aleha to teach you that you shouldn't. So that's what the Gemara uses that example. Ketzah, back into the Gemara. The pasuk says, don't eat kachim when you're tamei. Don't eat shlamim when you're tamei. Shlamim was part of the rule of not to eat kachim when you're tamei. Why did the Torah single it out? To teach you something about the general rule of not eating kachim when you're tamei. And to tell you the following teaching. Just like shlamim is uniquely, because it's kachem mizbeach, it's holiness that comes from the mizbeach. Avkol, and therefore you get kares. Avkol kachem mizbeach. Only time you get kares is if it's kachem mizbeach, holiness that comes from the mizbeach. Yatsu, exclusion to that, is kachem bedek abayis. If someone makes a plain donation to the temple of food, like chicken soup, if you eat it when you're tamei, you don't get kares for that. That's what the rule teaches you. Something that was part of the rule, the Torah singles it out. it not only teaches you for yourself, but also teaches you something about the entire rule. Let's say the same thing over here. Your wife's brother was a part of all the arayas. Why did the Torah say that no, you could marry your brother's wife? To teach you, just like your brother's wife becomes permitted in the Yibam situation. Every arayas, Nami Shayin, should be permitted in the Yibam situation. So that's what I would have thought. That's why Aleho teaches you not so. So now we have a reason why there should be an Aleho. So the Gemara asks back, no, midame, I would never make such a statement. Hasam, by the case of the Kachim, Klal Be'isr, the general rule prohibited you from eating Kachim when you're tamid. Uprat Be'isr, and the singled out one tells you the same idea, tells you that don't eat shlamim when you're tameh. So they're both on the same track. Therefore, it can teach you, the singled out one can teach you about the general rule. Hacha, but over here, the singled out one is an exception. Klal be'issa, the general rule says don't have relations with any of the arayas, your mother, your mother-in-law, your aunt, uprat beheta. But the singled out one, your brother's wife, he says in this case, you can marry your brother's wife. So maybe it's only teaching you that only if it has the arayas of your brother's wife, that's when you can do it. But if it has another arayas attached to it, let's say it's your brother's wife plus your wife's sister, then you can't. Holai dami, that wouldn't be that would be most compared. That means that if something wasn't a rule and it teaches you on novelty, it only applies to that singled out one and not anything else. And that's what we're saying over here, that this idea that you can marry your brother's wife only applies if it's your brother's wife and it doesn't have any other ever attached to it, because it's a novelty. That's not part of the rule. And where do you see similar to that? The Tanya we learned in the Braisa. Where do you see the application of that rule? There was something that was part of the rule. And it taught you some new idea. You can't return it back to the general rule until the Torah says that this rule, this exception applies to the general rule. Now here's the example. Ketzad. Here's the pasuk. It's a pasuk says, "B'shachat es hakeves bimkoim asher yishchat es hachatas v'es ha'oila bimkoim hachodesh bimkoim hakodesh ki chachatos ha'asham hu lakoyim." The Torah says that a Metzora, he brings 3 karbanos. When he wants to purify himself, he brings 3 karbanos. One of the carbon is a chatas, an asham, an oila. The Torah says that asham, that carbon asham, he slaughters it the same way that you slaughter a regular chatas. And the Torah says you slaughter it in the place that you slaughter a chatas and the oila. That's where you should slaughter this asham, this keves, the sheep asham. And then the Torah repeats itself, Ki kachatas ha'asham hu. This asham is like a regular chatas. Now, she'ein tamad loima kachatas ha'asham. The Torah doesn't have to say that word, that this asham is like a chatas. You already told me in the beginning of the pasuk, where should I shech this asham? Same place as where you shech the chatas, in the north side of the Beis Hamikdash. So why does it repeat itself? Why does the Torah repeat itself? There was something uniquely strange about the asham that a Metzora brought that was so uniquely strange. And that is that when a Metzora came to bring his asham, they actually took some of the blood in addition to sprinkling it on the Mizbeach. In fact, prior to sprinkling it on the Mizbeach, they put a little bit on his thumb and a little bit on his toe, on his thumb toe. So there was a novelty of this asham. So I would have thought that this asham is very different. I would have thought that you don't sprinkle any on the mizbeach and you don't bring the meat on the mizbeach, because you're doing something unique that you never do by any other carbon. You're taking the blood and you're putting on boyin yod or boyin regel hayamanis. You're putting it on a little bit of the blood on the thumb of the Metzorah's right hand and the toe of his right toe. So since it's a different type of asham, I would have thought that you don't sprinkle the blood and bring the meat onto the mizbeach. I would have thought that the metzora is way a different carbon, so that's why, and therefore it's different than every asham. We go to Zion Amud Beis, Talmud Loimer. That's why the pasuk had to teach you kichatas ha'asham hu. That repeats itself. That this asham is like a regular chatas. It just has one thing different. Ma chatas tu'una. Just like a chatas needs putting the blood and the limbs on top of the mizbeach, af asham, even this asham mitzayra, even though it has something unique to it, ta'un matan damim be'erim l'gabe mizbeach, needs to put the blood, you sprinkle the blood and put the meat on the mizbeach. So, but the point of that is, let's say you didn't have this pasuk of kichatas ha'asham hu, lemay denafek nafek. I would say that this asham would only have the service of putting it on his thumbs and nothing else. Lemay denafek nafek, whatever the Torah singles out for it, that should be done with this asham. That's what's done. Ulemay den loy nafek. When the Torah doesn't tell you what to do with it, loy nafek, we don't do it. So in other words, if something is very different, the Torah says something very different. If the Torah doesn't give you another pasuk to put it back into the group, then we leave it as something that is separate from the group. And so hachiname over here also, havamina eishes ach the ishterei, the eishes ach type of if it's your brother's wife, that's when the yibum is permitted. Shar arayas loya, but I would never think that other arayas are permitted, because again, you have this pasuk right over here. The pasuk says, don't have relations with any arayas, you get chorus. Then the Torah singles out that with your brother's wife, in a certain situation when he has no children, then you can marry your brother's wife. But it's a unique situation where the Torah is telling you it's permitted. So it singles it out, the brother's wife. So unless the Torah doesn't tell you something about the other arayas, I would say this singled out only applies by your brother's wife. But if there's another erva to your brother's wife, such that if your brother's wife turns out to be your daughter or your wife's sister, you should not do yibum. It's only in the case when there has no other arayas associated with it. So again, because of that, therefore, I would never think to myself that you can marry your wife's sister if she falls to yibum. So back to the original question. Then if that's the case, what do I need this aleha for? So the Gemara is struggling over here. So the Gemara answers, Ella, the final Gemara says like this, Ella, salka daite chamina, I would have thought, Teisu b'mamatzino me'eshes och. I would think that, the lightest thing you could learn the Torah with, the lightest rule is just plain, simple application without any questions. And what applies here, let's apply it there. Mamatzino, whatever you find in one place should apply in another place unless you have a question. If you have a quick question on it, then your logic is broken apart. So I would think like this. Just like you could marry your brother's wife, then I would say that you can marry your brother's wife if it's your wife's sister. So the Gemara says, wait a second, maybe midame. How could you say that? Hasam chad isura. When you're marrying just your brother's wife, you're only being over, you're only transgressing or allowing one isur. It's your brother's wife. But hacha, in the case when your wife's sisters fall into yibum, you have two problems there. One, it's eishes ach, it's your brother's wife, and two, it's your wife's sister. Trei isure. It's two isurs. So if there's two isurs, how would I say that it is permitted to violate two isurim for yibum? So the Gemara says, no, mahu the same. I would have thought when the Torah allowed yibum, hoil the ishtere. Since the Torah gave you a permissive, to permit you to do yibum with your brother's wife, so once they pulled the rug out from all yibums, ishtere. Once the Torah gives you hetters to pull the rug out from one isser, it automatically pulls the rug out from another isser. So, and how do you see such a concept? And we'll just end over here, where the Gemara is going to give you now a concept where you see this exact same idea, that something the Torah says is permitted, and because it permit you by one thing, it automatically permitted you the other thing as well, even though it's not relevant. Where do you see that this idea? Damrinin, hoil the ishtre. Once something is permitted, is permitted. Where do you see that idea? So let's just get this picture. This picture is we've seen this picture of the Beis Hamikdash, and we know that this is the Beis Hamikdash, right? Right in this area, this is the Ezra's Nashim. A Tvul Yom is not allowed to go or Mechusar Kippurim unless you're a perfect tahar. You're not allowed to go in the area where the mizbeach is, and certainly where the heichal is. There is a drabanan that did not allow you to even go into this if you're a Tvul Yom. You went to the mikvah. A Tvul Yom means you went to the mikvah, but the sun didn't set on you. This didn't set on you. Then technically you weren't even allowed to be in this area as well, but sometimes you have a person like a Metzora who really is tar. He went to the mikvah, he overnighted it, and he walks into here, but a Metzora has a big problem. He can't come into this area. Why can't a Metzora come into this area? Because he didn't have his karbonos. So, but yet the karbonos require that the blood should be sprinkled on his fingers. So what did a Metzora do? He would stick his fingers into the door over here, and the kohen would come all the way here and sprinkle him with the blood of the put it on his toes and thumb. So he never walked in, but he stuck his fingers in there. So now that you understand that, what happens if you have a double problem over here? So the Gemara is going to say like this: the Tanya we learned in the Brisa, Mitzoira shechol shmini shaloi be'erev Pesach. A Mitzoira that he has to his 8th day to bring the karbonos fell out on erev Pesach, and he wants to bring the karbonos. And he had a nocturnal emission that day, and he went to the mikvah. The problem is he's a Tvul Yom, so technically he wasn't allowed to even go into this area. He's a Tvul Yom. Granted, he's a Metzora, but he's pure. But now he had another problem. He had a nocturnal emission, went to the mikvah, but didn't have the sunset. So they granted him this leniency because this whole thing is anyway d'Rabbanan. They granted him this leniency that this Metzora should be able to walk up to the door over here. Because if you're not going to allow him to, if you're going to wait, then he's not going to be able to enjoy Karban Pesach, the Seder, that night. Because if he doesn't bring his Karban, then he's a Mechusar Kippurim. He's not allowed to enjoy the Karban Pesach at the Seder. So we gave him this leniency that if he's a Tvul Yom, we allow him to walk here to collect that. Now, even though even though no Tvul Yom is allowed to get into the Ezras Nashim, Zeh Nichnas, he goes into Mutav Shiyove Asay Sheyesh Baikaris, V'yitcha Asay She'ein Baikaris. The assay of doing, eventually enjoying your Karban Pesach that night should push away the assay, what the Gemara calls it an assay, but really it's in the Rabbanim, of walking through the Ezras Nashim. So we allow him to do that because he's in a tight spot, because we need him to become tar tonight to eat his Karban Pesach. So we allowed him that leniency. And Rabbi Yochanan said, Devar Torah afila es les leba. Even min Torah, a Tvul Yom is allowed to walk through here. Even a Tvul Yom is like, it's not even bigly a problem. It's only Isser d'Rabbanan. So the Rabbanim certainly will waive their strict stringencies over there. I feel that they made that rule that the courtyard should have a brand new rule. My chatzar chadasha. So this idea that they answered a Tvul Yom walking through the Ezras Nashim only occurred in Divrei Yomim. Chachamim made it happen, but really it's been a Torah. You're permitted to do so. So that technically a Tvul Yom would not have no problem if a Metzora Tvul Yom should have no problem walking up to the Shar Niknar over here. Okay, and stick his thumbs in. Now, hold cup. He's a Tvul Yom. He's a Metzora. So we allowed him to walk through here, but he has another problem, because once you stick your fingers through here, we almost in all times, Ula holds that even if you go in partially, it's almost as if you totally went through. And a Tvul Yom cannot walk into the here. So
could the Kohen walk through the other way to meet him on the other side?
No, so I should mention, if he got the blood out here, the blood left this area, it becomes puzzle. So that's very important. Great question. There's no other way, because you can't bring the blood out here to the street because the blood will become puzzle.
No, through the doorway, through the same doorway.
No, but then even if he goes out, if the kohen brings it here, it's puzzle. It has to remain in the green, in that green thing. So therefore, so when he brings his thumb in, but the Torah said that this is the way you do it. You stick his thumb in. Although normally when you stick your thumb in, it's as if your whole body came here, and your mechusar kapurim, the Torah really should not be in this area. But since the Torah gave you the leniency that it's lifted, that Isser is lifted because he's a Mitzorah, so we lift the Isser, we lift the Isser if this Mitzorah happens to be a Tful Yom at the same time. So we see this concept that once Torah lifts an Isser for you, it pulls the rug out from any Isser that you have. So the Mitzorah Tful Yom has no Isser, has no problem sticking his thumb into that door over here. So we'd say the same idea by the Yevama, that once we find that the Torah lifted and pulled the rug out and said you're allowed to marry your Eishes Ach, I think the Gemara says logically, let us say that the Torah had no problem with you marrying your Eishes Ach if it turns out that there's another Arayas attached to your Eishes Ach, if he happens to be your wife's sister. So I would think without any special pasuk that you could marry your wife's sister. That's why the Torah said the Oleha. So let's just finish that last line. Since the Mitzorah is permitted to stick his finger in, if it's just a plain Mitzorah and there's no problem, so even if he's a Tful Yom, that means he didn't have the sun set on him, so he has another tumah on him. He's also allowed to stick his finger in. So we see that once the Torah starts giving you heterim, permission to do something, it takes away all prohibitions. So I would think that the Torah took away all the prohibitions when it comes to Yibam, and yet you would be allowed to marry your wife's sister. That's why the pasuk says, allow that you cannot even marry your wife's sister if she falls to Yibam. So this ends the sugya. This doesn't end the sugya. I mean, we continue with this conversation, and that's why this conversation goes on another 3-4 pages over here. But it's one long sugya. The problem is in the yeshivas, they because they go so slow, they don't see the big picture over here, so they end up with a half a conversation.
Baruch. So what you're saying is that if they didn't have the word aleha, it would teach you the exception of the ervis, but it wouldn't say to you that it would also include in the ervis your wife's the sister. But yes, now that it says aleha, that's the exception to the exception.
That tells you the limitation of the exception.
The limitation of the exception.
In other words, the only time you can do yibam if it's only Eishes Ach, but if it's your daughter, if it's your aunt, if it's your wife's sister,
the 15 arroyos of the 21, right? Understood.
Right. The only one is permitted.
Marry your sister.
Yeah.
You can marry your sister.
That's Metunish. Afilis ifalsa